Hello my friends, welcome to lesson 3 of unit 4. Today we're going to be talking about ecosystems. So let's review quickly the hierarchy here. At the bottom, the most basic level of ecology is the population, all of the individuals that belong to a single species in an area. Okay, so all the antelopes in this case. When you add other living organisms into the mix, you create a community. So a community represents all of the different organisms that live in an area and the interactions between them. For example, the antelopes feeding on the grass, the symbiotic relationships between hawks and bacteria that are in their guts. Those are all community processes. The ecosystem, the next level up here, includes the community, but it adds in the environment. So you can see that rocks and the stream are part of the ecosystem. Okay, so that's the difference between a community and an ecosystem. An ecosystem includes the environment. Let's look at an example here. Obviously, these organisms are not to scale. They are scaled up so that you can see what they look like. But we have lots of living things here. We have plants, of course, many different types of animals. There are fungi. You can see the hyphae growing through the soil here. There would undoubtedly be, of course, billions and trillions of bacteria living in the soil and on the surface of all these things. So those are all the community. But then this is an ecosystem, so you also have the environment. You have the atmosphere. You have sunlight. You have temperature. You have soil minerals. You have dead animals. Okay? Those are all parts of an ecosystem, but not part of a community. In order to talk about ecosystems, we need to define some categories, first of all. And those categories define how an organism obtains its energy. An organism that creates energy for other organisms in the ecosystem to use is called a producer. Okay, to produce means to make, right? So these organisms are collecting sunlight and they're using photosynthesis to create glucose, and then that glucose is available to other organisms in the ecosystem for energy. So an organism that creates energy is called a producer. On land, these would be plants. In the ocean, it's things like algae that are taking over that responsibility. Other organisms eat other organisms for food. Okay, so if we start here at the bottom, here's our leaf. This is a producer. The caterpillar that eats the leaf is called a consumer. Okay, and consumer means to consume, right? Consumers can be classified as primary consumers if they eat producers. They can be classified as secondary consumers if they eat primary consumers, and they can be classified as tertiary consumers if they eat secondary consumers. Okay, the majority of organisms don't eat just one thing, but for example, it's pretty easy to classify a caterpillar as a primary consumer because they only eat leaves. Okay, so these are all different types of consumers. They are not creating their own energy, they're stealing energy from other organisms by consuming their organic compounds. And then finally, organisms that consume the waste and the dead bodies of other organisms are called decomposers. So they're getting their energy from the organic molecules stored in the once living bodies or the waste from the bodies of other organisms. And we know that bacteria are really important in this role, but from the last unit, fungi are also important decomposers. Here we have a log which has fallen in the forest, and these fungi are turning the cellulose in that log into energy and making use of that. So they're decomposers. So all organisms fit into one or more categories of those types of organisms. They can occupy more than one. Okay. This is what we call the energy pyramid. And we'll talk about why it's a pyramid later. We're just going to label it with the organisms that are present first. So at the bottom of the pyramid, we have producers. okay, making the energy. And then you can see the energy flows, following the arrows, up and away from the producers to primary consumers. Those primary consumers are then eaten by secondary consumers. And those secondary consumers are then eaten by tertiary consumers. Now, in some ecosystems, there are levels higher than this. Quaternary would be the next one up, but they get rarer and rarer, and you'll see why. Most pyramids just show these levels, but remember that all of these levels, all the producers and the different levels of consumers are feeding energy into this group over here. Let's see if I can do this correctly. Oh, no. These are decomposers. Hey, not too bad. So all of the different levels, these are called trophic levels. You don't need to know that term. They all feed into the decomposers. And that's a dead end. You'll notice that the decomposers don't give energy to anything else. That's sort of the end. In a moment, we'll talk about what happens to the energy in ecosystems in a bigger way, and you'll see what I mean by that. So that's how the different kinds of organisms all connect together in an ecosystem with regards to energy. Okay, please fill in your diagram. If you wanted to color the different levels of the pyramid and the decomposers, you could do that, but I'm not going to take the time to do that. So here's the bigger picture that I was just talking about. We start with energy from the sun, of course. That sunlight gives energy to decomposers, or I should say to producers, okay? The producers are transferring energy to primary, secondary, tertiary, and so on. They're giving their energy to the decomposers, okay? And throughout the life of all of these types of organisms, we have the loss of energy through heat. So plants are giving off heat, primary consumers are giving off heat, secondary consumers are giving off heat, decomposers are giving off heat. So energy is always lost in every ecosystem, and you'll see the consequences of that in a moment. The end result is that new input, new sunlight energy is always required. So energy cannot be recycled forever. It eventually is lost as heat, and that's true for physical systems as well. You cannot create a car which is 100% efficient. It's going to lose energy through heat in the form of heat from combustion, heat from friction. It's never going to keep all of the energy that's given to it but from the engine. Okay, same process. The reason that energy transfer is not complete between organisms is this. Let's say that a mouse consumes exactly 100 kilojoules of energy in its lifetime, which is a very round number, but that's the point. During its lifetime, that mouse will, through the process of respiration, be giving off about 30 kilojoules of that as heat. Okay, so that's all lost. Through producing waste, because remember the digestion, the nutrition of animals is very wasteful. Through producing waste and through dying, okay, about 60 kilojoules of that 100 kilojoules will be available to decomposers, okay, but only 10 of the original 100 kilojoules is actually stored, so to speak, in the body of the mouse. Okay. So what that means is that if something comes along and eats this mouse, it only gets 10 kilojoules out of the original 100 kilojoules that the mouse had eaten in its lifetime, assuming, this exactly round number. Okay. So that means if you do the math, quite simple, 90% of the energy that an organism collects in its lifetime is available to the next organism in the food chain. Okay, the remaining, or I should say, only 10% is available. 90% is lost. So if we look at this in the context of one of these pyramids, here we have a producer, which is a grass. Here we have a primary consumer, grasshopper. Here we have a secondary consumer, which is a small bird that eats the grasshoppers. And then here we have a tertiary consumer, which is a hawk that eats the little birds. Okay. Now again, let's pick some super round numbers. Let's say that exactly 1,000 kilojoules of energy is collected by the grass in terms of sunlight. If this grasshopper comes and eats all the grass, every little bit of the grass, it's going to get 10% of that, which is, you will agree, I hope, 100 kilojoules. If the bird comes and eats the whole grasshopper, one big mouthful, it gets 10% of 100, which is 10 kilojoules. And then the hawk swoops down, eats the whole bird, feathers and all. It gets 10% of 10, which is 1. Okay. So you can see very quickly as you make your way from one organism to the next, the amount of energy that's available to them decreases very quickly. Okay. And for this reason, the organisms that are at the top of the pyramid are always, not usually, there are no exceptions, they're always rarer. Okay, there's a reason why you do not see huge flocks of eagles. Okay, there's a reason why tigers and lions are rare in their ecosystems. Okay, one of the questions I always get as a paleontologist is, do we have any T-Rexes? And the answer is, of course, no, because Vancouver Island was under the ocean at that time. But T-Rexes are incredibly rare fossils because they were at the top. They had very little energy available to them. They were probably secondary or tertiary consumers. And so they must have been rare in their ecosystems in the Cretaceous. And that means that they're rare fossils, which means that they're less likely to preserve and less likely to be discovered. So if we return to the I was going to pull something. All right. If we return to this diagram, there's an arrow here. At the bottom of the pyramid, we have more energy. Okay. And we have more organisms. The most abundant organisms in any ecosystem are the producers. Okay, by any measure. If you measure them in terms of biomass, the raw tonnage, there's way more of them. If you measure them in terms of the number of organisms, there's way more. Okay, we are greatly outnumbered by plants. As you make your way up to the top of the pyramid, you have much less energy. And as a consequence, you have fewer organisms. Okay. Now, human beings have the choice. I shouldn't say that. We have a choice of where we fit in the consumer levels. We can't be producers. But we can choose to be primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, or quaternary consumers. Okay? And if you were foolish enough and rich enough to decide that you only ever wanted to eat tigers, the end result is that you would be, in essence, consuming thousands of times more energy than other people. Okay? This is the reason why I am a vegetarian. I'm a primary consumer. I want to be as low down on the food chain as possible so that I am collecting the maximum amount of sunlight per organism consumed. Okay, and that's the reason why it's often said that consuming less meat would be better for the planet. It would be much, much better for the planet. Okay, so if you can consider not eating meat once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, whatever the case may be, you're going to have a huge effect upon the ecosystem that we live in. Sermon over. Okay, so here, of course, is a joke. This is the food chain of humans according to The Simpsons. We do not eat all of these different things, though I'm sure people do eat platypus, or have eaten platypus in the past. So now we want to talk about nutrients. Okay, we've already talked about energy, which is these red arrows. Nutrients, unlike energy, are recycled. So they're captured, as we'll see, by producers, and following these blue arrows, they move into the bodies of primary consumers, secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, back to decomposers, and then they are returned to the environment as molecules, which is what these blobs are supposed to represent. And then they can be recaptured by producers again. Okay. So because of the law of conservation of matter, which you should recall from Science 10, none of the chemical processes that organisms use to extract energy can destroy the matter that makes up the planet. Okay, so it's a closed loop, and we can infinitely recycle the nutrients that are available to us. The way that these nutrients work in ecosystems is quite interesting. Here we see a summary of that process. Nutrients can be stored in oceans. They can be stored on land, and they can be stored in the atmosphere. A good example of this would be nitrogen. Nitrogen is one of the major components of the atmosphere, and then it's captured by prokaryotic organisms so that we can use it. And what you can see here is that nutrients are constantly moving back and forth between these different areas. There should actually be an arrow connecting the oceans back to the land, because there is a nutrient flow there, but it's a crude diagram. And you can see that nutrients are constantly cycling between the different parts of the environment. Okay, on land they will make their way through producers, consumers, decomposers, back and forth, and the same thing will happen in the ocean with aquatic organisms. Okay, so those are the 3 main places where these nutrients are found. Now there's more to this diagram, and we'll get to that in a second. Down below here we have what's intended to show what are called stores, nutrient stores. Now nutrients are not always, as this diagram shows, they're not always stored in the earth, but frequently they are. And 2 that are stored in the Earth's crust are carbon and phosphorus. The only exception, or one of the only exceptions, is nitrogen. Nitrogen is not stored in the crust, it's stored in the atmosphere. The process which stores these nutrients deep within the earth is very slow. Okay, so let's take phosphorus for an example. Phosphorus makes its way to the oceans, and it's incorporated into the bodies of organisms as phosphate. Those phosphates settle to the bottom of the sea, and they are turned over millions of years into rocks, and then those rocks are buried in the Earth's crust. Okay, so when I say slow, I mean slow. It takes millions of years for that phosphate, that phosphorus, to be restored. Okay. The problem is that humans come along and we very quickly extract those nutrients. So this represents human activity. We very quickly extract those nutrients from the ground. We mine them, we do whatever we need to do very fast, so on the scale of years rather than millions of years. And then we dump it back into the atmosphere, into the oceans, and onto the land. Okay? So what's happening is nutrients are making their way out of their stores far faster now than they can get back in. And as a consequence of that, nutrients are accumulating in ecosystems around the world. Well, you think, well, that's awesome. More carbon, more nitrogen, more phosphorus, yay! Well, like all things, too much of a good thing is bad. Everybody likes cake, right? But nobody, I think, would like to sit down and eat 10 cakes. Most of us would be ill, I think, after one. So having too much of a good thing is a bad thing. And we are quite literally poisoning the ecosystems of the world with too much nitrogen, too much phosphorus. We're pumping carbon into the atmosphere, which is feeding the greenhouse effect, and we'll talk more about that in the next lesson. Okay, so that's my summary of the nutrient cycles. Now we're going to look at a specific example in just a moment, which will illustrate this, I hope, quite nicely. Okay, so please take the time to label your diagram so that it looks like mine. So here we have an example. This is the carbon cycle. This is, by the way, from an old Science 10 data page. The previous curriculum, Science 10, used to include the carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles. So let's just see what's happening here. So what it's showing us is that carbon is stored in the atmosphere. Okay, photosynthesis brings it into the bodies of plants. It's then available to all the different organisms that live in the ecosystem. It then is also decomposed and found in the soil. Okay. It's also going into the oceans, becoming part of living things that live in the ocean. Okay. And ultimately, it is making its way down into the deep ocean. You can see there's huge amounts of it in the deep ocean. And it's becoming part of sediments and sedimentary rocks which make up the Earth's crust. It does so through the formation of carbonate ions, which become part of the skeleton of things like clams and snails. That's one of the minerals that's in their bodies is a carbonate. And that accumulates over millions and millions of years in these sedimentary rocks. Okay. Human beings come along and we extract the carbon out. One of the carbon sources we really like, of course, is oil and gas, but we also take advantage of coal, which you can see here. We bring that carbon out, we use it, okay, we burn it, and then it puts it back into the atmosphere. Okay, so this is the natural process, this is the human side of that effect. Okay. So you're not responsible for knowing very much detail about the carbon cycle, just that this is an example of a nutrient cycle, but I could ask you questions if I showed you a diagram like this. I could ask you questions about nutrients and how they move between the living and non-living parts of ecosystems. Okay, so the next lesson, the last lesson, lesson 4, we're going to be talking about biospheres, and that will be the end of Unit 4, and indeed, the end of Unit 4 is the end of Biology 11. So we're very close now. Please let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to talking to you soon. Bye for now.